Good evening, comrades. Welcome to our fourth session in this series on the elections, the general elections. We're taking another look back at the past, and we've previously looked at Marx and the Chartists and elections. And tonight we're looking at the French Workers' Party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and the Bolsheviks. So we're starting with Ian speaking about the French Workers' Party and the Social Democratic Party, and then Roger on the Bolsheviks. Thank you for joining us, comrades.
Right. I can't get this thing to. That's it. Sorry, comrades. A few glitches there. Good evening, comrades. In looking at Marxist parties of the past, it's worth having a look at those with which Marx and Engels were most intimately connected. So we're going to have a little look at the German Social Democratic Party in its various formations and the process by which a revolutionary program became a central feature of workers' parties. And as we'll go on to see, that was followed right through to the Bolsheviks. But also, they were intimately connected with the development of the Parti Ouvrier Français and to the extent of Marx having a hand in and actually simply writing their program with some minor assistance from Jules Guide, who was the leader of the party at the time. So, in looking at the various parties, the first real German mass workers' party really was founded by Ferdinand Lassalle. It's interesting to have a look at Marx and Engels' correspondence and look at the attitude that Marx and Engels had to the various contributors to the development of the German Workers' Party. Lassalle, certainly up to about 1863, enjoyed sort of fairly cordial correspondence with Marx. Not least of which because, Lassalle was a leading figure within the German workers' movement. He'd come from a comfortable background. His father, from a Jewish family, his father was a sort of textile merchant. His name was originally Lassalle, spelt with one L, and it was kind of changed subsequently to kind of efface the Jewishness of his background. But despite coming from a sort of a petty bourgeois background, he supported the revolutions of 1848 and was subsequently imprisoned for his pains, and established the German Workers' Association, and founded in Leipzig in the 1860s. But if you look at the correspondence about Lassalle from Marx and Engels, although they had, as I say, fairly good relations early on, Engels in particular was much more critical of Lassalle, and over time they eventually broke with him almost entirely. Not least of which because he continued to, in his kind of economic perspective, he was really kind of a follower of David Ricardo rather than Karl Marx, and continued to insist on stuff like the iron law of wages, over which the implication being that workers couldn't really increase their pay in any significant way without the market reasserting itself, as it were. So they were also very critical of Lassalle's tendency to emphasize the importance of a kind of intellectual and bourgeois element within the German workers' movement as its leadership. Remember, of course, that Marx famously had written that the liberation of the working class is the act of the workers themselves. Later on, as the German workers' movement eventually developed into the Social Democratic Party and was a thoroughly Marxist party, part of that process was the critique of the Gotha program. And it was really a critique of Lassallean politics in the context of the German workers' movement. So from that point of view, although Lassalle enjoys a particular place by virtue of being the founder of the first kind of mass German workers' movement, he really did, and he wasn't really able to develop his ideas because he was killed in a duel. But the critique of the Gotha program, importantly, is a critique of Lassallean politics. By the time we get to the establishment of the German Democratic Workers' Party, or the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, and Wilhelm Liebknecht, who was a member of the Communist League and had very good relations with Marx and Engels, although they were critical of him as well. Liebknecht too, and of course he was also the father of Karl Liebknecht, who we'll meet again in a moment. Also took part in the revolutions of 1848, and as did Engels, and he escaped to Geneva, where he met Engels in the period after 1848. So it established the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. He initially joined Lassalle's organization in 1862, but moved to Leipzig later, where he met August Bebel. Bebel had been elected to the North German Reichstag in 1867. What's important here, I think, and this will be the recurring theme, if you like, is that the standing in elections and in this context was standing as a revolutionary and using the electoral platform to advance the importance of socialist revolution, of worldwide socialist revolution. This was not an attempt to take office, as it were, in that context. So both. And it was also bound up with the kind of revolutionary internationalism that we've just discussed many times before, that was central to the work of Marx and Engels. So both Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel opposed the war with France, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, and both voiced their support in favor of the Paris Commune, and both were accordingly arrested. So Bebel and Liebknecht had effectively established the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany in Eisenach in 1869. And so in the literature, you tend to hear people talk about Eisenachers as people who were behind the program of the party founded in 1869 in Eisenach. And Eisenachers in this context meant, as it were, the Marxist wing of the German workers' movement. So Bebel and Liebknecht occupy a very important position within the context of both the demands for the widening of the franchise, even in the context of a Reichstag which had little or no power. Germany was not a constitutional monarchy in any way bound to accept what the Reichstag whatever resolutions the Reichstag passed, but nevertheless were determined to use that platform to advance the possibility of to advance the demand for revolutionary change. By 1875, you get a merger of those parties to form the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And it is in that context that you have the Gotha program that was previously mentioned of 1875, and Marx's trenchant critique of it subsequently. And just to put it into context, here is a party standing, a relatively new party standing, but won nearly 500,000 votes in a restricted franchise for electoral fora that had very little power, but were determined to stand on the basis of advancing the cause of revolutionary socialism. So the name the Social Democratic Party of Germany was adopted from 1890, and crucial here is Karl Kautsky, the so-called Pope of Marxism. He earned this sobriquet, which is not always, I think, meant as particularly flattering. in no small part because he was an intimate of Friedrich Engels. In the last 5 years of Friedrich Engels' life, Kolkowski was in London and subsequently became something of the literary executor of Engels, just as Engels had been the literary executor of Karl Marx. Kolsky and in Kautsky was even the literary executor of some of Marx's work that Engels hadn't got round to. So Theories of Surplus Value, for example, was edited and put together by Karl Kautsky initially, although not published until quite a bit later. And sometimes it's referred to as Volume 4 of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value. It's Marx's kind of outline of a history of economic thought, in a sense. Karl Kautsky, as this so-called Pope of Marxism, might be expected to have had a fairly decisive role, and as a theoretician within the SPD, and because of his enormous prestige of having been a close associate of Engels, did enjoy great authority within the context of the German workers' movement. And he was one of the authors, along with, interestingly, Edward Bernstein, of the Erfurt program of 1891, which is often reckoned to be a kind of orthodox Marxist program for the German Social Democratic Party. By 1912, as is well known, the SPD was despite being barred effectively from taking office, one of the strongest parties in the Reichstag. And so here is the situation where you have a party which by this time was much more than just simply the kind of political party that you would see in Britain or many other countries today. If you weren't in the SPD's reach went far further than just simply standing people in elections and that kind of thing. If you were into cycling, you could join a social democratic cycling club. If you were into hill walking, you could join a hill walking club with the SPD. It was a thoroughgoing association of workers in many different spheres. Kautsky was so well thought of, even by Lenin, that it's when eventually the German SPD voted for the war credits in 1914, it said that Lenin absolutely couldn't believe it and didn't believe it initially. And of course, then subsequently, what most of people know of Kautsky is Lenin's assertion of him as a renegade, as someone who betrayed the fundamental principles of socialist internationalism in voting for war credits for a fratricidal war in Europe. Bernstein and Kautsky both subsequently regarded, I think, the amount of support by the SPD for the war effort as having gone too far. And by 1917, both Kautsky and Bernstein had formed the independent Social Democratic Party. And so from that point of view, it's a little more complex and nuanced, even though Bernstein throughout it is often regarded as the beginnings, the beginnings not of revisionism, but the beginnings of a revisionism which is worked out in theoretical terms. Remember, the British Labour Party had never had a Marxist tendency within it. Really, it had never had a revolutionary program. People often talk about Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution. That's had nothing to do with Marxism. To secure for the workers by hand or brain. This is in sharp distinction to the liberation of the working classes, the act of the workers themselves. But by contrast, Bernstein had worked out a kind of theoretical perspective, which is actually, when you look at it, it's quite close to a more sociological attempt to analyze the position of the German working class, talking in terms of the movement is everything and the end is nothing, really, by reference to the fact that there was a growing middle class in the context of Germany and a professional class that was relatively privileged. And so from that point of view, you start to see the beginnings of a kind of a sociological reappraisal of Marxism, which has always existed in an effort to counter the revolutionary potential of Marxism. Meanwhile, in France, a similar process is taking place. I mean, we often hear the kind of narrative of, the renegade Kautsky and the betrayal of the German SPD of the international workers' movement. But the same kind of process was taking place in France at the same time. So what we start to see is a division between possibilists and revolutionaries in the context of the French workers' movement, the Federation of Socialist Workers of France, led by former anarchists Paul Broussais and Benoît Malon, a Marxist left led by Jules Guide and Paul Lafargue. Paul Lafargue, of course, was the son-in-law of Karl Marx, having married his daughter Laura. And so the possibilists who organize themselves around achievable gains within the context of capitalism and argued for a reformist political program was subsequently led by Jean Jaurès. But again, it's rather subtle and nuanced, because when we come to 1914, for example, Jean Jaurès was implacably opposed to supporting the war and was prepared to back the idea of mass strikes against the war. The Parti Socialiste de France, led by Guide and the former Blanquist Edouard Vallon, formed, as it were, the revolutionary part of the workers' movement. And it wasn't really until coming under pressure from the Second International that the Workers' Party in France united. Just as an aside, here's Jules Guide, originally born Jules Basile. Basile was his father's name, and he used his mother's name to avoid his father being kind of persecuted for his position, because he came from a sort of a respectable background, as it were. So really started off as a radical Republican and concentrating really on the rights of man. The editor of Les Droits de l'Homme, a refugee in Geneva in 1876, but gradually moved towards a Marxist position, but opposed at the time to taking part in revolutionary politics, part in electoral politics, partly as a result of his earlier influence by the anarchist Proudhon. And it's this accusation of his revolutionary phrasemongering which led Marx famously to say that if these people are anything to be judged by, I am not a Marxist. But of course, Guide eventually changed his view and was eventually elected as the MP for Roubaix in 1893. But Guide, like Kautsky, ultimately supported the war and didn't support the Soviets in the USSR when they took power. So Guide's legacy is not but I mean, he's usually less well known than Kautsky, because he left behind no real theoretical legacy in terms of his understanding of politics in general, and Marxism in particular. Lafargue, as is well known, was, quite apart from being married to Laura Marx, he was a close associate of Marx and Engels, worked with Guide in promoting Marxism in France. Paul and Laura translated much of Marx's work into French before they tragically died in a suicide pact in 1911. And Lenin actually spoke at their funeral. Jean Jaurès, who was the kind of leader of the possibilist wing, as it were, a Republican deputy elected as a Republican deputy in 1885, and then elected in 1893 as a socialist deputy, the leader of the possibilist wing, and approved very much in not just in standing for election for revolutionary ends to propagate the possibility of revolution, but it was in favor of the participation of socialists in government. And we can see these kind of strands within the French movement, which was subsequently also taken up by Guy during the war. But Jaurès founded L'Humanité. He eventually formed a united party with Guy. But interestingly, for somebody who's usually regarded as a reformist, he was implacably opposed to imperialism and militarism, and supported the idea of a general strike to stop the war. And we don't know really what would have happened had he not been assassinated by a nationalist, Raoul Villain. So the Parti Ouvrier, founded in 1880, and I think it's worth. I mean, I don't normally do this, but sometimes it's just worth reading something out that kind of sums things up. So here we have a program which was written by Marx, was dictated by Marx to Guy, and Guy subsequently included stuff in the political section and economic section. So the program of the Workers' Party of France and the Workers' Party of Britain could indeed learn a few things from this one, considering that the emancipation of the productive class is that of all human beings without distinction of sex or race, that the producers can only be free when they are in possession of the means of production. So here is a revolutionary program which is concerned with the means of production, not just simply occupying seats in Parliament for its own sake, as it were. It is only when they are in the possession of the means of production. That there are only two forms under which the means of production can belong to them: the individual form, which never existed in their general state and which is increasingly eliminated by industrial progress. Here he's talking about the personal possessions of working people. The collective form, the material and intellectual elements which are constituted by the very development of capitalist society. Considering that this is the collective appropriation can arise only from the revolutionary action of the productive class or proletariat organized as a distinct political party, that such an organization must be pursued by all means of the proletariat has at its disposal, including universal suffrage, which will thus be transformed from the instrument of deception that it has been until now into the instrument of emancipation. So throughout, Marx and Engels were not only willing to use the electoral process, but determined that the workers should use everything at their disposal to promulgate the possibility of revolution. Eventually, the Parti Ouvrier became part of the Parti Socialiste Français and the French section of the Communist International, the Socialist International. So the Second International, founded in 1889, but there were at the time, as it were, two separate conferences: Possibilists and a Marxist conference, and then later 1896 Congress with reformist and revolutionary factions. One of the things that, because of the destructiveness of the anarchists in the First International, they were effectively excluded. And it was really pressure from the International that led to the unification of the French party. And throughout, the Second International had reaffirmed its commitment to anti-militarism. Well, of course, we know what happened. Only Karl Liebknecht and later Otto Rühle voted against war credits. There was the split in the German SPD to form the independent Social Democratic Party of Germany in 1917, because even Kautsky and Bernstein regarded the support for the war as having gone too far. And really, it's the German Revolution and the workers' councils that it had thrown up that had ended the First World War. Remember that workers' councils had come into being in St. Petersburg in 1905, and is written about brilliantly by Trotsky in his book 1905. But it's really the German Revolution that ended the First World War with the mutiny of sailors at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. And it's really the German Social Democratic Party that opposed the revolution and effectively drowned it in blood. So Friedrich Ebert, who subsequently led the German SPD, effectively joined the 1918 strike leadership in order to break it, in order to guide it, as it were, into a peaceful end from the point of view of the ruling class. And he was in a pact effectively with senior military officer Wilhelm Groener to help to oppose the revolution. Workers' councils. It's an interesting area because, of course, many who look towards workers' councils as being the means by which socialism will come into being sometimes overlook the fact that many of the workers' councils in Germany at the time, in the absence of a unified communist party, were those workers' councils themselves could often include members of the SPD. They could include liberals. Famously, even Max Weber, who had a hand in writing the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, was on a workers' council. But of course, the other features of the German Revolution was the feature of workers in arms. Arms had been distributed to a population which, of course, was well used to using them. By 9th of November, Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the German Republic. Karl Liebknecht, independently, had proclaimed a socialist republic of Germany, but the Communist Party of Germany wasn't formed until the 1st of January 1919. By which time the Spartacist uprising was quickly defeated, and Gustav Nosk, a senior figure within the German Social Democratic Party, had ordered the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. This set the scene for the disastrous split, really, with the Communist Workers' Party of Germany splitting from the Communist Party of Germany, and also the founding of the German General Workers' Union as a kind of syndicalist arm of syndicalist wing of the German Communist Workers' Party. So we have this tragic history, and Lenin's famous little book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, was published in 1920. Here you see the original kind of name, which is taken directly from the Russian, the infantile sickness of leftism in communism. Written for the Second Congress of the Comintern, and it's a critique of Kautsky and others, but it's also a critique of the ultra leftists, as it were, of communism in Germany, a critique of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, and other characters within it. Anton Pannekow, the council communist, is referred to as Horner. It was critical of left-wing communism in Britain, and the refusal, for example, of Willy Gallagher occupying a significant place within the developing Communist Party of Great Britain, for his refusal to take part in electoral politics, and of course others such as Sylvia Pankhurst, and then famously talking about the support for Arthur Henderson, the leader of the Labour Party, one of the leaders of the Labour Party, as supporting him as a rope supports the hanged man. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Ian. Over to you, Roger.
All right. Comrades, hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Well, it's a hard act to follow, Ian. That was a really absolutely stunning and thorough presentation of the whole history, of particularly the French and the German origins of the labour movement. I'm not going to try anything quite so ambitious, I'm afraid. I'm concentrating on the record of the Bolsheviks in relation to parliamentary elections and parliamentary procedures. And I'm going to focus first on their attitude towards the Duma, which was a kind of mock parliament introduced by the Tsar out of panic at the time of the 1905 revolution onwards. And then also, because there's so much confusion and myths about it, the Bolshevik attitude towards the Constituent Assembly, when after the October Revolution. So I'd like to start by saying, you know, we're often misrepresented, we Marxists, as enemies of democracy. And according to the bourgeois mythology, didn't the Bolsheviks ban opposition parties? Didn't they shut down the Constituent Assembly? Didn't they impose war communism, create a one-party police state, etc.? And actually, I mean, I'm not going to attempt to answer all those questions in this particular session, but on the contrary, it should be noted that far from imposing a one-party state, the first Soviet government was not even a one-party government. It was a coalition with the left SRs. And this is not the place to explain the later emergence of a tyrannical Stalinist police state, which of course had nothing in common with Bolshevik traditions. The constant efforts of the enemies of democracy and the working class to ascribe to the Bolsheviks the crimes of their Stalinist gravediggers are, of course, a travesty. So let's examine specifically the attitude of Marxists and specifically the Bolsheviks towards parliament and elections. First, a word about one of the attributes of Marxism which is least recognized, often by its own adherents, and that is what I could call its modesty. Because unlike the assorted sectarians that were their contemporaries, Marx and Engels had never sought to impose a priori utopian fantasies upon the realities of the class struggle. They saw it as their task, above all, simply to learn from the actual historic experience of the working class and to adapt their scientific conclusions accordingly. It was, after all, the workers of Paris in the Commune of 1871 who demonstrated to Marx, and not the other way round, the necessity of smashing and replacing the bourgeois state machine rather than simply commandeering it. The workers of Paris rose up in the struggle to take hold of their own destiny, and in the course of that experience, it was their own collective leap of imagination and improvisation that shaped the form that workers' power would take. Marx's genius consisted above all in his ability to watch, to listen, and to learn from their experience, and to condense it into theoretical conclusions. All the elements of workers' democracy, the rotation of administrative duties, the strict limitation on official remuneration, a workers' militia, Soviets, etc., these were not devised by Marx or Lenin in their own heads and then imposed on the living reality of the movement. After all, that's the definition of sectarianism. All these attributes of workers' democracy were derived from the process of the struggle itself as it unfolded. So again and again, at the high points of history, it was always the creative energies of workers in struggle which showed the way forward. The mark of the great revolutionaries was their insight in grasping these lessons. There are, of course, countless examples. It was the actual course of the Russian Revolution which sharpened up Lenin's earlier incomplete and what Trotsky called algebraic formulation of its tasks as a democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasantry into workers' rule. It was the course of the revolution itself which demonstrated to Trotsky something to which he had previously, as he freely admitted, given inadequate weight, as he called it, the imperious necessity of a centralized Bolshevik party. We're all constantly reminded of the need, therefore, to question outworn shibboleths and test them against reality as it unfolds. So, another relevant example, which is coming really to the meat of this discussion, in 1905, it was by their own spontaneous improvisation that the workers in what was still then St. Petersburg demonstrated in action the crucial role of the Soviets as democratic organs of workers' power, much to the dismay originally of the local Bolsheviks, who were initially skeptical and distrustful of what they perceived as a threat to their precious leading role of the party. Trotsky was, of course, the chair of the St. Petersburg Soviet in 1905, and it was to the lasting credit of Lenin, at that time, of course, they belonged to rival factions, that the Bolsheviks were so quick to acknowledge the form of organization that the workers themselves had created. Now, flexibility is needed all the more with purely tactical questions. So there's no single fixed definitive answer to the question, are Marxists for or against participation in Parliament? Let's remember, in 1850, Marx insisted on participation even in rigged elections for the advantages they held. Just to quote, he said, even when there is no prospect whatsoever of their being elected, the workers must put up their own candidates in order to preserve their independence, to count their forces, and to bring before the public their revolutionary attitude and party standpoint. But 20 years later, when it came to his review of the experiences of the Paris Commune, Marx contrasted its incomparably more democratic character to the bourgeois parliamentary system, which he mocked, of course, as, quote, deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in parliament. And Lenin really only slightly amended that when he said later, the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism is to decide once every few years which member of the ruling class is to repress and crush the people through parliament. Now, but over a period of just 12 years, Russia went through a series of political convulsions and upheavals requiring constantly changing kaleidoscopic shifts of tactics. And Lenin listed sharply distinct phases, which he classified as follows. The years of revolution, 1905 to 7. The years of reaction, 1907 to 1910. The years of revival, 1910 to 1914. The imperialist war, 1914 to 1917. And the second revolution in Russia, as he called it, February to October, 1917. And as he explained, in relation to this varied experience of the Bolsheviks, the alternation of parliamentary and non-parliamentary forms of struggle, of the tactics of boycotting parliament and that of participating in parliament, of legal and illegal forms of struggle, and likewise their interrelations and connections, all this was marked by an extraordinary wealth of content. So their attitude towards parliament and their corresponding tactics changed accordingly. So first, let's have a look at the Bolsheviks' attitude towards the Duma. The Duma was a quasi-parliamentary institution set up by the Tsarist regime as a token concession wrung out of it following the outbreak of the 1905 revolution. Now, the establishment of the Duma was a gain of the 1905 revolution, which shook the absolutist state to its foundations. It was a token acknowledgement of the end of personal autocracy, and it was the first hint of accountability. And while it failed to overthrow the monarchy and overturn the semi-feudal social relations of Russian life, it did force the Tsar to grant this limited constitutional reform a legislative assembly. But from its birth, this State Duma was a deeply undemocratic institution. Rather than being elected on a one-person, one-vote basis, parliamentary representatives were elected separately from each social class, divided therefore into landlords, wealthy city dwellers, workers, and peasants. And the allocation of delegates was, of course, heavily weighted towards the rich. There was to be one deputy for every 2,000 landlords, but only one for every 30,000 peasants or 90,000 workers. Moreover, Lenin's Social Democratic Labour Party was still an illegal organization, that is, both wings. There was still an illegal organization which the Tsarist state constantly clamped down upon. Now, the question came immediately, should revolutionaries have participated? Faced with this monstrous caricature of democracy, the immediate reaction of the entire RSDLP, both factions alike, was boycott. Lenin faced an uphill struggle trying to win support for participation in elections, not only among groups like the social revolutionaries, who were exclusively focused on terrorism as the sole weapon to be waged against Tsarism, but also from Lenin's own comrades. Lenin argued that despite the rigging of the elections, participation in them would offer real advantages. Namely, since deputies were to be elected separately from each social class, that meant that workers' deputies had to be elected in all the big factories in every major industrial area. And this gave revolutionaries the opportunity to lay out their election program in front of mass meetings of workers in each of the major workplaces and have their candidates elected by a show of hands. And that was an opportunity that Marxist parties in Western Europe could only dream of. And once socialists were elected to the Duma, they would gain a vital platform in a society in which political discussion was repressed by police surveillance, state violence, and of course the threat of deportation to Siberia. Now, at first, Lenin failed to convince the Bolsheviks to run candidates. But when that first Duma was disbanded in July 1906, after just 2 months, for Lenin, this abrupt autocratic shutdown of Russia's first elected assembly was a key moment that shed new light on the realities of Tsarist society, lessons that he would constantly impress upon the Bolshevik parliamentary deputies until the RSDLP Duma faction was finally outlawed, having agitated against the First World War in 1915. Now, the main party of the capitalist class, the cadets, had failed to do anything to defend the First Duma beyond giving highfalutin speeches in its chamber. Lenin believed that this highlighted two important lessons. First, it demonstrated the danger of parliamentary cretinism, a term that Lenin borrowed from Marx. Secondly, it dramatically underlined Lenin's thesis that the Russian capitalist class was incapable of leading the sort of bourgeois revolutions that their English and French counterparts had made in the 17th and 18th century to destroy feudalism and smash the power of the old aristocratic ruling classes. The liberal capitalists and their political arm, the cadets, were simply too scared of the risk of working class uprisings to lead a movement against the Tsar and the great landowning nobility. So thus Lenin was able to expose the fact that instead of the capitalists leading a bourgeois democratic revolution to overthrow the feudal aristocracy, it was the task of the working class to take matters into its own hands in alliance with the peasantry to overthrow Tsarism. And Lenin used the debates in the Duma to expose to the working class the unwillingness of the liberals to confront the aristocracy and simultaneously to show the peasantry that only a revolutionary alliance with the working class could give them the land. So by participating in this truncated Duma, Lenin was thus shown to be a champion of democracy in the face of the dirty smears that he was an elitist or a despot. Not only did the Bolsheviks grasp with both hands the opportunity to participate in elections despite the utter rottenness of the Duma, but they also went to great lengths to ensure that their deputies were accountable to the rank and file of the party. Now, this second Duma lasted only a little longer than the first, just a matter of a couple of months. When it too was dissolved, the question of future participation in the new Duma, convened in 1907, became the flashpoint of a new debate. This time, Lenin was categorically opposed to participation. He called not for abstention, but for something very different, an active boycott. On the eve of a conference which had been called to reunite the two wings of the party, following the earlier split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, Lenin said he welcomed the prospect of unification, but the one point that he raised was the question of participation in the Duma. So he said, and this is a direct quote, "There is still one point on which the two halves of the party disagree, the State Duma. All party members must be clear on this question. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks are agreed that the present Duma is a miserable travesty of popular representation, that this fraud must be exposed, and that preparations must be made for an armed uprising to bring about the convocation of a constituent assembly freely elected by the whole people." Sorry, 1 second, I lost my place. The dispute, he said, is only about the tactics to be adopted towards the Duma. The Bolsheviks say that our party should take part in the election of delegates and electors. The Bolsheviks advocate an active boycott of the Duma. And then he explained what that meant. What does an active boycott of the Duma mean? Boycott means refusing to take part in the elections. We have no wish to elect either Duma deputies, electors, or delegates. Active boycott doesn't merely mean keeping out of the elections. It also means making extensive use of election meetings for social democratic agitation and organisation. Making use of these meetings means gaining entry to them, both legally by registering in the voters' lists and illegally, expounding at them the whole programme and all the views of the socialists, exposing the Duma as a fraud and humbug, and calling for a struggle for a constituent assembly. And he just continued, why do we refuse to take part in the elections? Because by taking part in the elections, we should involuntarily foster belief in the Duma among the people, and therefore weaken the effectiveness of our struggle against this travesty of popular representation. The Duma is not a parliament. It is a ruse employed by the autocracy. We must expose this ruse by refusing to take any part in the elections. The Duma is not a parliament, but a new police fraud. And so he went on. I won't read any more of that, but I think he made his position very, very clear. Now, the Bolsheviks eventually did participate in the Duma until they were kicked out in 1912. Sorry. And that was, of course, almost the lowest point of the counter-revolution. Now, what about 1917? In 1917, the Bolsheviks had a similarly flexible approach to the Constituent Assembly. Actually, although they are constantly branded as the people who destroyed the Constituent Assembly, who destroyed any chance of a legitimate parliamentary democracy and so on, the fact is that the call for a Constituent Assembly was one of their principal demands following the overthrow of Tsarism. Because, after all, a Constituent Assembly is not just a parliamentary legislative body. It's a special tribunal convened in order to formulate a new constitution. Hence the name. A Constituent Assembly is an assembly created to constitute a new state apparatus, a constitution. So the Constituent Assembly figured prominently in the Bolsheviks' program in February 1917. They demanded an immediate peace, land to the peasants, workers' control of the factories, immediate convocation of a Constituent Assembly, and a truly democratic republic. So even on October the 25th, that is speeding up, if you like, going fast forward to the October, the first day of the October Revolution. On October the 5th, it was the meeting of the Congress of Soviets, which had begun with Lenin going to the rostrum with the immortal words announcing, "We will now proceed to the construction of the socialist order." But in that same speech, he continued, "The Soviet government will ensure the convocation of a Constituent Assembly." Now, sure enough, elections did take place on 12th of November. And the early election returns gave big majorities to the Bolsheviks. But when results arrived from the provinces, it was the social revolutionaries, and especially their right wing, who were the winners. And the final tally, when the election results came in, was social revolutionaries 299, Ukrainian social revolutionaries 81, left social revolutionaries 39, Bolsheviks 168, Mensheviks 18, cadets 15, and an assortment of others 83. So how could this have happened? A proletarian insurrection in Petrograd, and at the same time an endorsement of the status quo in the provinces. How could this have happened? Why was this? And the reason is because the provinces were remote from the scene of the decisive battles of the revolution, without, of course, media communications, and moreover, of course, in conditions of mass illiteracy. the participants in the provinces were unaware of the rapidly moving developments and the debates in Petrograd and Moscow. Mostly, they were unaware even of the fact of the October Revolution. The right social revolutionaries prevailed because the peasantry were far removed from the daily debates and the rising consciousness among the workers in the factories and the soldiers in the garrison, who in effect constituted the armed peasantry. And of course, in Petrograd, the consciousness of the workers and the soldiers had overtaken that of the peasants in the countryside by leaps and bounds. How then, in this situation, were they to react? The Bolsheviks were uncertain and irresolute, and Lenin himself at first abstained from participating in the discussion. He was himself at first undecided how to cope with this conjuncture. So the Bolsheviks were in doubt, they were divided. The Bolshevik parliamentarian deputies, led by Kamenev and others, were keen to participate. But on December the 11th, Lenin finally proposed that the Bolshevik delegation be dissolved. But, and again, this is an answer to those who think that Lenin commanded the party like an absolute dictator. When he made that proposal, he was overruled. Lenin went on to the offensive. He argued that the inevitable coming clash between the Constituent Assembly and the Congress of Soviets would constitute a confrontation leading to civil war. Because by that time, far from being a revolutionary call to arms, the call for a Constituent Assembly and even the slogan "all power to the Soviets" had by now been opportunistically taken up by, surprise, surprise, the cadets and even the white generals, the Tsarist remnants of the old state. It had become objectively a counter-revolutionary slogan. The Mensheviks and the SRs demanded the immediate convocation of the assembly, but meanwhile the forces of armed counter-revolution, the fascist White Guards, were already arming and mobilizing their forces. In parenthesis, by the way, it should be noted that far from the caricature of the Bolsheviks as ruthless, bloodthirsty tyrants, the fact is that they were initially hopelessly split and soft and naive. The first armed revolt, the first counter-revolutionary revolt, was led by the Cossack general Krasnov. And how was that snake defanged? What happened is it was done by a friendly visit to their garrison by two Bolsheviks, no more, who discussed and argued and convinced the troops to hold fire pending peaceful negotiations, and following which they actually released Krasnov himself simply on the basis of his assurances that he would not try to subvert the authority of the Soviets. And of course, once released, he promptly fled south and began to mobilize, together with other white generals, a counter-revolutionary army. So what happened with the Constituent Assembly? It met on January the 18th, 1918. The Bolsheviks immediately proposed a motion that it ratify the measures already taken by the Soviet government, therefore legitimizing the power of the Soviets. This vote was rejected by 237 votes to 138. The Bolsheviks and the left SRs then walked out, never to return. And that, in fact, was the end of the Constituent Assembly, because after a few hours of inconclusive blather, the Assembly dispersed, never to reconvene. And the important thing is that public opinion was supremely indifferent. Nobody missed it for 1 second. By now, the revolution had far outpaced and overtaken this constitutional trapping. It had become no more than a sheep bauble. In the context of Soviet power and simmering civil war, the Constituent Assembly could now have served only as a rallying center, a war cry for the counter-revolution. Suddenly, every Tsarist and counter-revolutionary and fascist in the world was raising on high the completely unfamiliar to them banner of parliamentary democracy and a Constituent Assembly. Everyone from Cossack generals to, for instance, Winston Churchill in Britain, who was soon to spend millions of pounds in the attempt to overthrow workers' and peasants' power in Russia. Nowhere did the cry for the Constituent Assembly appeal successfully to the workers and peasants. They understood who championed it and why. And that's why it was dispersed by the revolutionary regime, and that's why it was not mourned or missed or even remembered by the people of Russia. The result was inevitable. They rallied ever more firmly around the Soviets and the Soviet regime. So, were the Bolsheviks inconsistent in their approach? Yes, they were, and quite rightly so. Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks adapted empirically to the rapidly advancing march and progress of the revolution. I'd like to quote from one quite interesting book, which I would recommend comrades, if they haven't read it, to read, by somebody called Silverman, called Leninism Under Lenin. And he wrote, perhaps overstated his case a little, but it's worth keeping in mind what he says. Today, it appears to us that each leap forward made by the revolution was transcending its bourgeois limits, intensified its character as a socialist revolution. Lenin, however, hesitated on this point, groping his way, and sometimes contradicting himself. These approximations and varying definitions will surprise only those who wish to see in Lenin an infallible master and omniscient planner of revolutionary strategy. And this he was not. Silverman actually says, I don't quite agree with him on this, but he was not even, he says, the real theoretician of the revolution, but merely the maker of it. But he was right to say that it was Lenin's absorption in practical activity that doubtless prevented him in 1917 from formulating and deducing theoretical conclusions from the lessons of events, and hence the theoretical hesitancy of his approach initially to the problem of the Constituent Assembly, which of course he made up for very greatly by his boldness in practice. Now, finally, quite rightly, as the context of the debate shifted, so too necessarily the approach of the Bolsheviks had changed accordingly. It was only subsequently and implicitly that Lenin in practice even acknowledged Trotsky's formulation of the tasks of the revolution as set out in his prophetic earlier writings on the theory of permanent revolution. But on this question of the Constituent Assembly, Lenin wrote with absolute characteristic clarity, sharpness, and simplicity. This is how he explained the situation. The Bolsheviks began their victorious struggle against Mensheviks in a very cautious manner, and the preparations they made for it were by no means simple. At the beginning of the period mentioned, we did not proclaim a boycott of the bourgeois parliament, the Constituent Assembly, but said, and following the April conference of our party, that's following the April theses, began to state officially in the name of the party that a bourgeois republic with a Constituent Assembly would be better than a bourgeois republic without a Constituent Assembly, but that a workers' and peasants' republic, a Soviet republic, would be better than any bourgeois democratic republic. So, finally, what would replace a bourgeois democratic constitution? Soviet power. And as we said earlier, its principles were not artificially imposed from the sidelines, let alone dictated from on high. They arose from the organic process of the revolution itself. It was in the feverish months of the revolution itself in 1917, not at some projected promised land of the future, but in the course of the actual living process of history, when Lenin was in hiding, following the premature uprising of the July days in Petrograd, that Lenin wrote his classic work, State of the Revolution. And in that work, he set out, once again, not from a preconceived recipe, but from actual historical experience, the practical form the workers' democracy was taking. And it could be reduced to the following principles. No standing army, but the armed people. All officials to be elected by the workers with direct right of recall. All officials to receive the wage of a skilled worker. And of course, we have to add the footnote to that in the prevailing conditions, the shortage of skilled technicians, etc., a clearly defined maximum differential of 4 to 1 was grudgingly permitted. And of course, that was a fatal concession which in isolation and over a period led to the crystallization of a monstrously privileged bureaucratic elite with a differential of not 4 to 1, but 40, if not 400 to 1, and of course the monstrosity of Stalinism. And finally, though, popular participation in all administrative duties, direct management through Soviets, workers' councils. And that is a means of running society more rational than any parliament, than any constituent assembly, or than any previous state machine in history. So thanks, comrades. I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Roger. Tour de force, very good. Also, Ian's introduction, very, very interesting. Comrades, if you have a question, if you'd like to make a contribution, please click raise hands. I've got a couple of questions for you both. Get the ball rolling. Ian, I mean, Roger, I think, drew out really well the question of tactical flexibility when it comes to standing in elections. It's not a principle either way. You know, we have to always stand or we always have to boycott it. So it's it depends on the circumstances entirely. So in a bourgeois parliament with all its limitations, sometimes the best you can do is use parliament as a platform. And Karl Liebknecht did that quite well. I mean, he gave some stunning speeches, didn't he, in Parliament, even though he was he was in a total minority on that. But that perhaps, you know, once there is a revolutionary upsurge, you have to adjust pretty quickly, and a bourgeois parliament then becomes a burden or something that has to be overcome rather than participated in. How did, especially the Social Democrats but also the French party, did they have those kind of debates on flexibility, on how to engage with Parliament and elections, or was that perhaps too early, and because there hadn't been a revolution then, that they didn't get to those kind of debates?
The first thing about Karl Liebknecht, I would say, to preface anything else, is that one of the ways in which he was frequently shouted down was the demand for unity. Because he was in a very small minority of demanding a kind of transition to socialism, he was often shouted down on the grounds of, you know, the Social Democratic Party has to retain its unity, despite the fact that the leadership of the Social Democratic Party had been responsible for crushing the revolution, both by its alliance with the command structure of the German army, but also you know, directly in ordering Liebknecht and Luxemburg's killing. But the debates around the tactics involved in standing for Parliament, there were tensions because you know, if you stand for election, do you take office, for example? I mean, you don't really see anywhere in Marx, Engels, and you certainly don't see Wilhelm Liebknecht or anyone else saying, you know, if offered a minister's post, should you take it? No, there was no suggestion whatsoever of that. But there was debate within the context of the French party about whether one should take, and Jean Jaurès represented that kind of contradiction. On the one hand, he was anti-militarist. On the one hand, he was in favour of a strike to stop the First World War. But on the other hand, he was prepared to take office. So there was that kind of strange contradiction in the right wing of the French movement. And of course, ultimately, it was expressed by Guide, who did take office during the First World War. So yes, there were debates, and I think that it is a very clear dividing line. Again, are we always saying under no circumstances would one take office? I think you have to look at that whole question of tactical flexibility and say, you know, what would be the purpose of taking office? You know, would inevitably, when the kind of shattered remnants of the Second International Socialist parties have taken office, they've always ended up suppressing the interests of the working class. And from that point of view, there is I suppose the principal feature of it is to what extent can you bring about socialism by taking office within a bourgeois parliament. I think standing for parliament is one thing. Taking a seat within parliament as a workers' tribune, as it were, is one thing, but to take office, it puts you in a completely different position altogether. And from that point of view, generally it should be avoided. I'm not saying never, but generally it should be avoided. And it was certainly a contradiction within the French party.
Yeah, on this point, Alexandre Millerand, obviously, I guess that's who you're talking about. Do you know a bit more about it? I mean, he started off as quite a socialist and then became war minister and basically, helped to organize the slaughter of their brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. And of course, you see, I mean, you've seen exactly the same thing with the Labour Party in Britain. It's often, helped to effectively marshal the working class behind the interests of the war. So although someone like Ramsay MacDonald, for example, was in principle opposed to the war, it was largely on pacifist grounds rather than socialist grounds. But Mitterrand, you end up with a socialist who's better at marshalling the working class behind the interests of capital than even the capitalists, and that's the danger. That's the thing that's to be avoided. That's the area where office becomes completely corrupting, and no serious socialist should do it.
And we have the same. I mean, I'm from Germany, as you can tell. The Linke in Germany is very keen to participate in governments whenever they can, local government, regional government, etc. And of course, first thing that happens is you have to manage capitalism. You have to manage budget cuts. You have to basically take money away from libraries, from children, kindergartens, etc., etc. So you end up attacking the working class, and you get punished for it at the ballot box. So it is really a lose-lose situation. Similar, of course, Rifondazione Comunista in Italy. We had all sorts of examples of the European left really not learning that lesson about not participating in government under these conditions. I mean, there could be totally different conditions if there's a rise in working class resistance, etc. If it's a pre-revolutionary situation, then you could possibly consider participating, because that could spark something happening on the streets, etc. Roger, in terms of then what the looking at today and sort of any lessons we can draw from the experience, and you've described, I think, really well the situation, how it was in Russia, but from today, how can we, looking at the general elections today and all these independents standing, and they're being sold to us as that's a really good thing, all these people standing on their own platform, etc. Everybody's doing their own thing, but we really do need a party, don't we? We do really need to be organized in one party. What kind of lessons do you think we can learn? What kind of party? How can it be a party that is as flexible and tactically astute as the Bolsheviks were?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. I think we all do. But the question is, we need a mass party. We don't need. I've said this in other contexts, but I mean, we see this really bizarre situation at the moment of a sprouting of little parties, all really puffing themselves up into being something far more significant than they actually are, because they are in fact cliques, and some of them led by people who just want to have a little build a little empire in which that's almost got a fantasy world. I'm not going to name names, but we do have, as a result, we have the situation, and I keep complaining, but I mean about my constituency, where we've got three three independent, well, not three left candidates, unless there's some more that I haven't heard of yet. But we've got the Workers' Party, we've got the so-called Revolutionary Communist Party, and we've got the one that I'm supporting as just an honest militant trade unionist who's standing as an independent. But the question is, all of this, you know, it's worth standing, preferably one per constituency, not more, but in order to use it as a platform to speak, it gives you a voice. It gives you one thing. I mean, I always enjoy participating in elections and canvassing, because it's the one opportunity you have to just knock on a stranger's door and have a political discussion with them. And normally it's something which you don't get that opportunity, and you speak to a lot of people, and you establish, well, you actually get them thinking, and you get some ideas from them too about how to formulate your ideas and all the rest of it. But that's the question of taking office. Well, obviously taking a seat in Parliament, there is I mean, in the current context, we're not talking about a Tsarist Duma. In the current context, of course, it's if you have somebody, you can use that as a platform to be a tribune, to denounce the political representatives of the ruling class, to speak to a much wider audience than you could just as an individual without that position. It's obviously something which is you know, which it's an opportunity that should be used. As for that's for representation in Parliament. As for taking office, if you mean ministerial office and so on, I mean, I cannot conceive of any circumstances except in a revolutionary context where you could do that. But we have to be careful of that too. I mean, I think there is a place for not just standing for election to local councils, but to running local councils, provided you use that again as a platform and as a to refuse to carry out the policies, the repressive anti-working class policies that you're instructed to. I do think, although mistakes were made, and you know, I don't want to go into the whole history, but overall, I think the record over 5 years of the Liverpool City Council in the 80s was a model. I thought it was absolutely right. It got the support of the entire, you know, more or less you could say the entire population of Liverpool. It organised tens of thousands in general strikes, token general strikes. It defied the government. It held out for 5 years. It when the councillors were surcharged, they organised collections throughout Liverpool in order to pay the astronomical sums that were being demanded of them. And what is interesting, which I didn't know before, but I only found this out recently, that they not only appealed to the population of Liverpool for donations in order to meet the surcharges, but they insisted that nobody should give more than 50 pence. They didn't want to be seen as a burden or an imposition, and they wanted to ensure that, you know, to force themselves, if you like, to get the widest possible support on the basis of an appeal to the entire population, and they did cover the entire cost, several £100,000, I think, of the surcharges. So I'm just giving that as an example. But generally speaking, you wouldn't take any office. The only position you would take would be if it would strengthen your voice and strengthen your power to defy the ruling class and its state machine.
And running a council, I mean, that has become a lot more difficult as well since the 80s,
yes,
and the budget cuts, etc. So I'm not sure that kind of example could be repeated. And I said that there were mistakes then, there'll probably be a lot more mistakes these days. But you know, we're nowhere close at the moment to that situation. Ian, did you want to say anything in response to that, or shall we bring some questions?
No, just open it up to the floor, I think.
Okay. Matthew, who's for some reason called Tina.
Yeah, I know. For some reason.
Okay.
It's
Go ahead.
that cover you've got on this thing anyway. So, yeah, I think that the thing you can almost look at it the other way, though. Of course, is that the ruling class itself, the capitalist class, is not democratic by nature. I mean, it had to be forced. Thanks. It had to be forced to concede, the universal franchise. It didn't concede the universal franchise until after the Russian Revolution, when it was in fear of its existence. And you see all this sort of fight through the whole of the 19th century and into the 20th century for the vote. And of course, when you're talking about all of these parties, starting in the 19th century and into the early 20th century, of course, they're operating on rotten franchises. Most the vote vote was split by class. People didn't have the vote, they didn't have property. All these sort of methods were used. These methods, of course, still apply in places like the US, where lots of people have different weights in votes. Because it's to say that it's undemocratic. The point being also is, as Marx said, I mean, so presciently in his analysis of the commune, that you can't simply lay hold of the mechanisms of the bourgeois state for your own use. There is a difference. I mean, the thing, I think that the point being is that obviously, given the fact we had to fight to get this thing out of the ruling class, and given the fact it does offer some kind of a tribune, then absolutely where it's possible to use it, then we should use it. But the point is to understand that these structures belong to the ruling class, they're not ours. As socialists or as revolutionaries, who represent a completely different power, to that which exists in Parliament, and that's quite clear. And you can see the problem is you can see, by the behaviour of all the various forces and so on in the sorted parliaments that of course they don't understand that at all. But the thing is, obviously, now you're also seeing a situation where, under the current conditions, the bourgeoisie is increasingly moving towards a dictatorship. Starting with the hegemon in the United States. I mean, it's a real question, as to the continuation of democracy at all, which is going to change politics completely on a global scale. And you're sitting in a situation, say, on Tuesday, where hundreds of thousands of Kenyan youth demonstrated towards the parliament, which passed an oppressive bill to tax them, while the cops were opening fire on them outside. And the response of the youth was to try and torch the parliament. I mean, quite entirely reasonably. They tried to set fire to the place. They tried to set fire to the city hall as well. And the basis, obviously, these people don't represent us, and this institution doesn't represent us. But the question is, as a revolutionary, how do you actually draw out that contradiction? And the key now, of course, is to say, right, okay, well, what is the alternative to this mess? What is the alternative? I mean, people look at, you look at what is going to happen now, of course, is that Parliament in this country will be in utter disrepute as well. You can see it getting worse. It already stands pretty low, but the next government is going to get a lot worse. And the question is, okay, well, what alternatives do you have, and how do you understand why that situation is? Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Ian or Roger, want to say anything?
I'd just like to draw a distinction between what Marx and Engels were arguing for, which is socialism, which is the working class taking power for itself, and in particular, the means of production, and what we might call state socialism. Or, I don't think it even deserves the name socialism, but the idea of seizing hold of the state in an effort to... There would always be good grounds for using a place in Parliament or local council to bring about reforms that would further the interests of the working class, whether nationally or locally. So, I would happily stand for election to the local council, because Durham City Council has got a pretty bad record when it comes to attacking workers' terms and conditions, and you could use that position to do that. But the minute you start getting yourself co-opted onto the finance committee or some other thing, then you face up with the simple fact that if you're saying, well, you're going to set an illegal budget or do some other things which are going to lead to a direct confrontation, you're almost certainly going to lose outside of a mass revolutionary upheaval. Unless you've got that, you're on a hiding to nothing if you're just trying to take power. And what you end up doing is, colluding in laying workers off in the end, and bringing some considerable opprobrium on the left. You end up making ourselves look ridiculous, really. So I think it's important, because when you look at, for example, the French Workers' Party, and you look at the Workers' Party of Britain, that are currently standing, okay, I'll be voting for them, because the alternative is some dreadful apparatchik imposed by the Labour NEC. But when you look at the Workers' Party of Britain, what they're advocating is state socialism. They're advocating the idea that you could just sort of, all you need is enough Workers' Party of Britain representatives in Parliament, and hey presto, we've got socialism, comrades. No, what you'll have is the Salvador Allende route to oblivion. I think that's probably where you'll end up. The ruling class isn't going to give up so easily. I mean, if you've got, for example, an explicitly revolutionary socialist party that's overwhelmingly elected by, say, 60% of the population, then you could do something with Parliament, and you could do something, but you would have to confront the property relations first and foremost, because that's where the power lies. And you have to be prepared, for example, to say, well, we need to disarm the armed forces in favour of a workers' militia, because otherwise you will just end up in front of a firing squad.
Yeah. Roger, do you want to say something?
No, nothing to add, really.
Okay, Ken, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First, thanks to Ian and Roger for a fascinating session. My question is about, if you like, Lenin and Germany. Ian referenced Lenin's surprise that, the German socialists voted for war credits. Now, he may have been surprised because he didn't have enough information about what was happening in Germany, or he'd been given the wrong information or misinformation, or there may be another possibility. What I'm curious about is, when the German Revolution was happening, how far was Lenin better informed about what was happening there? Or was it the case that he didn't have more information, or he simply didn't have the capacity or resources to intervene effectively because he had his own issues to deal with at the time? I mean, obviously his circumstances at the time of the vote for war credits and at the time of the German Revolution were significantly different, but I'm just curious as to whether he learned anything from the lack of information in 1914 and tried to improve his knowledge about what was happening in Germany after the First World War, or how far there's another explanation for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Roger, do you want to take this first?
I think that's Ian's department.
Okay, Ian. Then.
Well, if you'd have asked me that 20 years ago, I would have. Well, I think it is fair to say that I think Lenin underestimated the extent to which social democracy had been completely corrupted. If you look at, I recently had cause to read the proceeds. Well, I haven't read it all, but I've read the program of the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party in 1903, and although it's much longer, it really does follow the pattern of the French and German Social Democrats, and that's conscious. I mean, Lenin, did to a certain extent maintain quite a close relationship with Kautsky and up until 1914, and so I don't think he really did understand just how corrupted social democracy had become. Whether that was still true when he was writing Left-Wing Communism is something which is up for debate. The German and Dutch council communists argued that you're asking us to have an alliance with people who had just slaughtered the revolution, just drowned it in blood. And so that's one of the reasons why you got the split in the German Communist Party. The other aspect of it is that Kautsky, whatever you think of him, was arguing that the Russian Revolution was premature, and of course others have had the same argument. I mean, if you if you fancy an evening of innocent merriment, have a chat with people from the Socialist Party of Great Britain, who will tell you they held that view a long time ago. That the revolution was premature, but what Kautsky was really presenting was a perspective which saw the move towards world communism in a kind of very mechanistic way. That is to say, you have to wait until all the conditions are there before you can possibly move to world revolution. And all the conditions being there would mean, presumably, a situation where a country the size of the Russian Empire would have to be fully developed as a capitalist society before it could even contemplate socialism. So in other words, socialism is put off to an indefinite future when the whole of the world is ready for it, as it were. The very thing that often people on the far left are accused of, or something, it's unrealistic to expect revolution to break out all over the world. If you cast your mind back to the development of capitalism from feudalism, although capitalism, as it were, isn't fully developed all over the world, it's still a world system. It's still a world system almost the moment it comes into being. If you're looking at the development, if you take the English Revolution of the 1640s, the British Navy is already very adept at fighting the Dutch for control over colonies and all the rest of it. It is becoming a world system. And it's becoming a world system because the conditions for capitalism being a world system were already in place. It's not accidental that the Black Death of the 14th century wiped out a third of the population. World trade was already a feature. It was already a feature before the end of feudalism. So the basis for capitalism being a world system was already there, even though so the English Revolution, a bourgeois revolution, could take place and be a world system and export capitalism effectively around the world. So the short answer is, I think I genuinely feel that Lenin didn't fully understand just how corrupted social democracy had become, and that's why he was surprised. I'm not sure he fully understood what had gone on in 1920 when he wrote Left-Wing Communism. But I can see why, at the same time, he would have argued for a unified communist party in the context of Germany in particular, and in the United Kingdom. So I can understand why he would disagree with Sylvia Pankhurst or Willie Gallagher or whoever else, and argue that the Communist Party of Great Britain, when it was founded, should have an attitude towards elections that was about promulgating revolution. I don't know whether that answers the question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anthony, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I think there's big dangers in what Ian is saying. in terms of an incomplete break with Stalinism, particularly entering bourgeois governments, because this goes back to 1848 when Blank was his last, I think it was Louis Blank, was the first social democrats, utopian socialists that went into a bourgeois government, made certain concessions, and led to the crushing of the working class when they closed the national workshops down. And for Marx, class independence is very important of the working class, and this is very relevant now. Because some of the SWP, WRP, counterfire adapting to popular frontism in France in the election. I don't think I wouldn't support the Greens as a middle class party, but I support Mélenchon, the Social Party, Communist Party, the Alliance of Workers United Front, excluding the Greens. It was a bourgeois party. I wouldn't vote for it, but we've got to attack the idea of a popular front. But I think the crisis. I think the first time, I mean, what happened was the French middle class went from ultra-leftism to opportunism. And I think in 1893, the late 80s, they got 50 seats in there, the Socialist Party, after the Dreyfus crisis for radicalisation, and reformists got incorporated into there. But let it in 1970. Well, let's look at my thought process again. My thought process. Of course, yeah, running at that power Bogdanov, I think when he called for a boycott, it's an imperialism and Peter criticism. We have to have a dialectical approach to capitalist democracy. It's there to incorporate capitalism and all the opportunism of social democracy. And the Popular Front alliances are like the Social Democratic and Socialist parties in these coalition governments, have led to what Tina said. But we shouldn't be in reformist governments. We haven't got confidence in them. But in the July days, what Ian was saying about the left communists and the ultra-left July days, the Social Democrats crushed the workers. Kerensky was part of it. Then we called for the mention the social revolutionaries to break from the capitalist ministers, and the boss had the Bolsheviks run the middle class. But they had an alliance with the left social revolutionaries, which was the middle class left peasantry, and over as Trotsky said, without winning the peasantry, capitalism was in with the bankers on the outskirts. That's without the peasantry, couldn't have made that revolution with a tiny working class. But remember, Lenin had the sages theory, and that's it was for class independence. He didn't trust the liberals. He had the two, what's it called, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasants. You know, one of the weaknesses of Rosa Luxemburg picked up, particularly about to a certain extent Kautsky, I'll finish on here, is that the parliamentarians, the journalists could betray the revolution because they're incorporated in capital, particularly after the 1905 revolution. But we have to have democratic transitional democracy. Fascism is a major danger in France. The ruling class is split. We've got the working class united and they'll be settled on the streets. It's either going to be a popular front government I don't agree with, or the left wins the three parties, or there's going to be a mass upheaval with fascism and civil war. But there's big danger of popular. The RCP is the other extreme, not seeing the danger of fascism, which reflects those pressures of the right. I'm an ultra left guy. I'll leave it there. I got my memory back. It's on my memory.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a complicated one, isn't it? Because let's cast our mind back to the description of the German SPD as social fascists by Stalin, and what a disaster that was. Should revolutionaries get into kind of popular fronts with reformist parties of one sort or another? In the context of France today, it is a defensive act. I think that, the idea that Mélenchon and the Communist Party and the Greens and all the rest of it could get together to kind of hold back Le Pen's party is a defensive act, and I don't have a problem with that any more than I have a problem with, well, it would have been a great thing if Stalin had not destroyed the possibility of a useful alliance between the German SPD and KPD to keep fascism at bay. But I don't think the situation we're currently facing in France is fascism. I think the idea of an authoritarian right-wing nationalist government is not the same as fascism. It's the idea that that's just a kind of, it's at that point that fascism just becomes an epithet, just something to throw at people. And I don't think that is the situation that France is in. I don't know what will happen. I think it's good to keep Le Pen's party out, if at all possible, because the likelihood is it will be authoritarian, it will be nationalist, it will be a carnival of reaction. But the idea that it's fascist in the way that the Vichy regime was in France, or Hitler in Germany, or Mussolini in Spain, is nonsense. Because after all, what's the mass base of Le Pen's party in France? It's not a huge petty bourgeoisie that's caught between the hammer and anvil of capitalism on the one hand, and a potentially revolutionary proletariat. So I suspect that what will happen if Marine Le Pen ever gets the presidency is that in the end she'll do as she's told. She'll do as she's told by the ruling class, just in the same way that Meloni in Italy has effectively moderated her terms, moderated the way in which she speaks about Mussolini or whatever else. I mean, I remember when being told that Franjo Tuđman in Croatia was an out-and-out fascist because he just adopted all the kind of trappings of the Ustashi regime. But we didn't see fascism in Croatia. We might have a nationalist authoritarian government or whatever, but that's not the same thing. So popular fronts, yes, it's not simple. I think I hope they keep Le Pen out, but I don't believe fascism is an imminent likelihood in Europe.
Yeah, agree. Roger, do you want to say anything on that?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Ian up to a point, but I think we have to say, first of all, yeah, Le Pen will do what she's told by the ruling class, but it works the other way. The ruling class are backing Le Pen because they want to adopt policies which are at variance with the regime they've had in the last few decades. They do want to, and it's not only in France, it's a European phenomenon and almost a worldwide one. They want to adopt a much sharper, harsher, more confrontational stance in relation to the working class and to the rights of the population. Now, I would say Le Pen is a fascist. I'd say Meloni is a fascist. I'd say Bolsonaro was a fascist. I'd say Modi was a fascist. But that does not mean that when they're in power, that they can impose a fascist program. Absolutely not. Because the point is that they don't have the forces. They don't have a mass street army as Mussolini and Hitler did. They can't destroy the working class. They can impose authoritarian repression from above, but they cannot pulverize and destroy the organizations of the working class, and that means that they are in a very weak position. I think if Le Pen comes to power, she won't destroy the labor movement any more than Meloni has been able to, etc., or Bolsonaro was, or Modi was. The point is that they, as we've seen, Modi thought that in the recent elections, he thought that he could get an overwhelming majority and change the constitution and establish a Hindu communal regime and so on. But he was denied that possibility because he could not control the situation. There was a mass revolt and he was deprived of his majority. The same with Bolsonaro, who lost his position. And I think, in other words, if you like, I agree with Ian, the alarmism, the idea that this is fascism and so on, that's wrong. The decisive battles are still to come. This is really the precursor to a movement which could develop into street fights and situation, I don't know, of pulverization of the labor movement and so on. But we're nowhere near that yet. First of all, the working class still has it hasn't spoken yet, and it will. And I think if Le Pen comes to power, I think she could also be defeated, both in being unable to carry out her program and maybe being overthrown, at least in the next election. And in other words, I agree we should avoid alarmism, but we should also understand that this is a serious warning. It's a last warning, if you like, to the Labour movement, that they have to get their act together and they have to mobilise and they have to make sure that the threat does not materialise. That's the way I would put it.
Thank you, Roger. Marion.
Yes, I would. Anthony wasn't saying that fascism was on the order of the day, but I think Ian downplays it. And there's some people that say that Le Pen and these other figures are not fascists. Yes, they are, just like Tommy Robinson is in this country. And it's very dangerous if we underestimate it. The working class, I agree with Roger, the working class hasn't spoken yet, but we have got to get our act together. And if we don't, then we don't know what's going to happen. We're living in a very dangerous world at the moment. Yeah. Everything is in flux. And we have to be aware of that. The economic conditions, if we don't get these situations right, and class independence is key, actually, what alliances we make and when we make them. And I think what Tina said earlier is it's critical that we understand what the balance of forces are in the situation that we're in. And this is key. But what I do want to say as well, when Roger talked about Liverpool, at the same time you had Lambeth stood out for a long time. The GLC was fighting for a limited period, but unfortunately that alliance broke down, and then you had the collapse of it. And that they were important battles that we didn't win. And that's part of the reason we're in the mess we're in now. But unless we start to seriously understand the dangers that we are confronting in terms of the move to the right in Europe, but also in this country with Nigel Farage among certain layers, and unless we actually start to organise in a lot of the areas, the old what was called the Red Wall, unless we start seriously doing proper campaigning work and community work in some of these areas to win the hearts and minds for socialist ideas and having a programme that we can put forward, using transitional methods, different demands to build a movement that would then mean that we've got the balance of class forces that we could fundamentally change this society. And we do need voices in Parliament. We do need powerful speakers that will be in Parliament advocating for the working class, advocating for democracy. You know, we need more people like that actually in there making the kind of speeches that need to be made. We need to be, wherever we can, raising the issue of the demands that we want to take the situation from where it is today. And I think we have to be careful not to underestimate the rise of the far right. And we haven't won all the ideological battles within the working class. And we need to have some of these debates out.
Thank you, Marion. I mean, we are not going to be able to talk about fascism properly tonight, but next week we've got a session on the European elections with a speaker who knows about the situation, particularly in Germany and Poland and in Britain, and we'll probably have a discussion about that. Is the far right on the rise, and what does it mean in terms of threat of fascism or not? I think there's quite different views on that issue, even on this small panel. To sum up, comrades, could I ask you maybe both to do 2-3 minutes each on sort of the key the key lessons we can learn from, you know, those who've gone before when it comes to elections as you see them. Can we start with you, Ian?
Well, I agree with Marion on one thing. Absolutely, we're living in dangerous times. I've argued in another place and not been necessarily agreed with that all an army has to do to lose a war is to lose the will to fight, to realise that it's completely hopeless, and then you just get out of the trenches and you go home. And I don't know to what extent the Ukrainian war will continue simply hemorrhaging Ukrainians. At which point does NATO step in and have a direct war with Russia? And that is something which could transform everything, both in terms of propelling an even more authoritarian approach, and not to mention the absolute destruction of a nuclear war. Beyond that, of course, the situation in Palestine shows us one thing. Firstly, it's possible to have an international movement including millions of people. The problem is that international movement doesn't have a direction, doesn't have a party, doesn't have a program which can put forward some kind of solution, can't effectively. And so what we end up doing is demonstrating week after week, month after month, until such time as conditions change. And that's not something, and that's, you know, the people of Palestine need more than that. And of course, the other thing that's going to change is the situation in the USA. I don't know what a Trump presidency is going to be like. What we do know is that he has his own authoritarian tendencies. What we do know is he has his own nationalist tendencies, and a capricious, difficult to judge what's going to happen next feature of him. We certainly do live in dangerous times, and I also think there is a distinct possibility of a significant realignment on the right in Britain. I don't think Farage, the Reform Party, is going to get many more than a few MPs, but that in itself might form the basis of some sort of realignment on the far right in Britain, and that will be a dangerous situation. What will they be able to do? We've seen what happened to Liz Truss when she sort of overstepped the mark. Whether that would happen again, and whether it would be possible for that realigned far right in Britain to take any kind of action. How could they act against the stock markets? How could they act against the interests of the ruling class? I don't think that's on the horizon. But nevertheless, the move to the right has to be resisted, and it has to be resisted. But I would argue it has to be resisted on a Marxist program, and not just on the basis of some kind of lowest common denominator party that will put forward some demands in the hope that we can all rally around the idea of a left-wing party, a Labour Party 2.0, as it were.
Thank you, Ian. Roger.
Yes, okay. First of all, on that last point, the Ian's, I'm absolutely agree. What has happened? If you look at the opinion polls now, for instance, all right, Labour seems to be heading for a massive majority, but that's because there's been a split in the Tory party. That's the real point. If you look at the opinion polls, if you take the Tories plus the Reform Party, and actually there's very little difference, if any, in their policies, they're pretty well neck and neck with Labour. That's the reason why there'll be a big Labour majority on a low poll with mass abstentions, with lots of votes for third parties, for none of the above parties, and I do think there will be a fusion of the Tory party. It's already, I mean, the split has begun already when Johnson threw out all the anti-Brexiteers from the, including, very eminent people like Kenneth Clarke and the rest of them, and Heseltine and all the rest. And I think that what we're going to get is a new party, which will be the Tory party fused with the Reform Party. I predict that the next but one government will be led by Johnson plus Farage. I think Johnson would they'd like to bring him back as a figurehead, because for some reason they think he's popular. God knows by what criteria, but anyway. So that is a danger, and that means that is part of what we were talking about already. There's got to be a general movement worldwide of the ruling classes to abandon the sort of old liberal democracy stance. And from, we already see, like Italy, we could see in France soon, we could see in Germany a coalition of the right-wing parties with the AfD. You could have all over Europe, we've seen that situation, plus a Trump presidency in the USA. And as I say, that's not the end of the story. That's not our defeat, but it means a completely new phase in the struggle. And we've really got to get ourselves organized. And it is one thing, first of all, I think it was I was jubilant to see that for once that the French left parties have managed not to split their vote. We are again and again, we've seen, even in the last presidential election, if the left had got their act together, you could Le Pen would not have got on to the second ballot, probably. Mélenchon would have got on, and he could well have actually won the presidency. That would have been a possibility, but at least he would have been the main opposition to Macron. But this time, anyway, it's it's a relief to see they got their act together. We may not, we can quibble about whether the Greens should have been included and so on, but it's not a popular front, even though they call it that. It's not a popular front as in the 1930s. It's an alliance against the centre. It's against Macron as well as against Le Pen and the far right. And what we need in Britain is we need, with all due changes according to the traditions of the situation here, what we need now is, instead of this lunatic situation, as I say, of sprouting of pop-up parties all competing with each other and just degenerating into cliques, what we need is a new mass movement of the working class. And that means that just as originally the Labour Party was formed because the trade unions didn't want to form a socialist party. They wanted to have a party which would represent their interests in that case, to defend their right to strike, to protect their means of their raison d'etre. And so they broke away from the Liberal Party and they formed a Labour Party, a party of Labour. Now, there must be surely a movement, not, of course, we're not talking about the union bureaucrats, but within the rank and file, there must be surely under a Starmer government, which will be, of course, itself a very right-wing government, not like Labour governments of the past, right-wing even compared to the Blair government, the new Labour government. But there will be a movement from the militant activists within the unions to say, what the hell are we still giving our money to this party for? We need to create a party which will defend our interests. And I think there should be a campaign, and I predict that there will be, to get the act together, not by just linking up this little clique and that little sect and that little committee and which all exists now. All of them, play a role in that, but it will have to take on the heavy battalions of the labour movement, which they do still exist. It's true the trade unions are not what they were half a century ago, but the trade unions are still the only mass force in society, and they have to find their political voice. And I think, well, I'd finish on that point.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to start another discussion on that. I would have a few disagreements with
perhaps I
Roger
should
on that
answer
as well.
Julian. Not of course, just to answer Julian, I'm not advocating for a replication of the errors of the formation of the Labour Party in the past. But I am saying that the heavy battalions of the working class of organised labour need a voice. They need a political expression of their own, and I'm sure that sooner or later they will come to that conclusion and fight for that. And of course, it can't be like the Labour Party of the past. Because it's in a new context, and I hope that some lessons would have been learned.
And us Marxists would be calling for a Marxist communist program of such a party, or at least a party where you can argue for such a program rather than.
Of course, should be free discussion within the ranks, but you know, we're not in favour. I'm not in favour of a party with a pure principle standing on its own. It should be a tendency within a mass party, and would fight within that party for recruits to their program and their ideas.
We can probably discuss this a bit further next week. We'll be looking at the European elections, the results, and what it means for the working class movement across Europe. Not entirely positive, generally, the election results, but perhaps there are some openings for us to get involved also about the need for the European left and the European working class to actually get together. It used to be a lot closer cooperation when we looked at the First and Second International. There's not much happening like that at the moment. So looking forward to that session next week and hope comrades can join us. Thank you both, Ian and Roger. Very fascinating introductions and a very good discussion. Thank you, comrades. Good night.